So the Inazuma Chronicled Wish is coming up, hosting a good deal of the Inazuma characters and their weapons, with Mizuki thankfully nowhere to be spotted. So how relevant are the Inazuman roster and their weapons today? Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be going over the Inazuma Chronicled Wish from worst to best, while discussing how good their characters on the banners are, their best teams, and then discussing their early constellations and weapons. But before we do that, as always, if at any points during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, your support means the world to me, and with that out of the way, let's begin. Actually no, before getting into each character, obviously if you like any of the characters, there's no real shame in pulling who you like, despite how I may analyze them. All of the characters are good enough to clear all the content in the game, if you're playing them optimally, and with a mode like the Theater which promotes diversity in your roster, there may be a need to pick up one of these units, even if they overlap with whatever you may have. I'm going to be ranking the units subjectively based on a balance of their value and strength in the meta. If you disagree, sure, leave a better list down in the comments. And now let's actually begin, in which I think the worst character here is just going to be Yoimiya. The on-field pyro DPS role is extremely saturated. The best DPS in the game right now is a pyro DPS, and despite the fact that Yoimiya has received notable buffs in both Chevreuse a year ago and Sitlali recently, she still loses to other characters with the exact same teammates that are able to hit more than one enemy at a time, which is Yoimiya's biggest drawback. She is a single target locked DPS in a meta where most of the best single target units are also able to dish out amazing AoE damage, and that's why it's hard to recommend her. And her vertical investment paths are also not that great. Her constellations really don't do much for her, and her 5-star bow isn't that much better for her than options like Rust or Slingshot, so you're better off just getting constellations on supports like Sitlali or Farina to make her feel better, if that's what you desire. Overall, besides her range, which isn't even that much of an upside as you still have to fight close to enemies, Yoimiya doesn't have any features besides being cute that allows her to carve a niche or compete with the other DPS units we have right now, so she's in dead last and not really worth the pull, while also probably being the worst character to lose to, as everyone should have a solid pyro DPS by now. Now to speak more on her weapon, Thundering Pulse is a decent stat stick, so if you lose to the weapon it isn't the worst thing in the world, but I wouldn't necessarily choose it either because there are much better bows in the game. Any of the recent bows would do you better, like Polar Star, Aqua, the First Great Magic, and Astral, and even Skyward Harp can be competitive with Thundering Pulse for a lot of characters whilst being a standard banner weapon, which you can refine much easier. So yeah, not a bad weapon to lose to, it's still a good stat stick, better than most 4-star bows, but I wouldn't choose it. Next up, back to back with DPS units, because I'm going to be placing Itto here. He's such a weird fucking character to rank. He's a Geo DPS that utilizes his combos to try and get consistent charge attacks to have quite good AoE. His main problem is just that his team situation is very awkward, and he isn't synergistic with a lot of the current roster. His G3O or Mono Geo core both are kind of With Mono Geo, without a C2 Shalonen, you're ruling out some of the best supports in the game of other elements to get a team that has very underwhelming performance by today's standards. Though even if you switch to something like G3O teams using Farina or any other generalist support, then you have a new problem with the fact that very little characters synergize with the charge attack, defense, scaling, Geo DPS unit, and Goro's healing is the equivalent of your grandma kissing your bruises, so he doesn't generate a lot of fanfare. And at C0, Shalonen doesn't shred Geo resistances with under 2 elements, so that also, yeah. So even if you added generalist supports to his teams, it still ends up performing relative to Mono Geo teams. It almost feels like if you want to play Itto's charge attack playstyle, you have to dolphin out for a C2 Farina or C2 Shalonen to make this type of playstyle feel very good, which sucks. Though if you do get the pieces for it, it's a very nice feeling team. But with that type of investment, you could just put it towards a better team and it will scale better. There are still other Itto teams you can do that aren't as reliant on his charge attack playstyle, like his plunge teams, which can actually feel better at C0 than his Mono Geo teams. And there's also his double Hydra teams, which tend to be his best teams generally at C0, as you get full access to Shalonen's buffs as well as consistent fanfare, as well as having both Farina and Yolan's damage. The team does also keep most of Itto's identity, as you can do his charge attack combos here, but even though this is the best team you can do for Itto at C0, there are much better characters that can use a double Hydro core, even in this banner, which is ultimately why Itto is this low. There's this one commenter I know that has a C3 R1 Itto. I really wonder if they're going to get C6. Ironically enough, for Itto's vertical investment, I wouldn't get any of his constellations personally. I would much rather prioritize things like Shalonen C2 and Farina C2, just so he has a more complete G3O team, and I would also get his weapon Redhorn, as it's a bigger personal damage increase for him than getting a C1. And then after getting all of those things, if you still want to vertically invest into him, then go ahead. His constellations are actually pretty decent. And for Redhorn in general, it's not that amazing of a weapon honestly, unless you're a Noel main. There are much better 5-star claymores like Beacon or Malvika's weapon. Though I guess if you don't get the Battle Pass to get Serpent Spine, then it can be a pretty solid weapon in that regard, if you're losing to it. I still don't really think it's worth going for though, so let's move on. It really does pain me to put her this low because she has some of my favorite teams, though I think next we have to go with Kokomi. Kokomi. Miss Jellyfish has two different playstyles, either as an off-field healer slash Hydra applicator, or as an on-field main DPS slash driver. In regards to her off-field playstyle, Kokomi compared to other healers doesn't really do anything besides apply Hydra and AoE, so there are a lot of just better healers currently that you'd rather use over her. In Ayaka teams, people used Sholonen, and now Escoffier is going to just eclipse Kokomi Ayaka teams. In Electrocharge teams, you could also just use Sholonen as well, and the best Electrocharge carry being Chlorine is able to self-sustain anyways. And if you're using Vape teams, most of them run Bennett as a buffer regardless, so she didn't really see play there either. Her most notable off-field role was for Nilou Bloom teams, as her healing and AoE Hydra application made the team very comfortable to pilot, and she was arguably the best option for it, though nowadays Nilou just doesn't see that much play. And because the biggest thing the team struggles with is single target or boss checks, you are generally better off running a strong talent damage dealer to help beat those checks. So as an off-field support, Kokomi doesn't really shine anywhere anymore, as just healing and applying Hydra is not enough compared to what other healers can offer in their niches. For Kokomi's on-field playstyle, however, it's aged a lot better in my opinion ever since the release of Furina. From the Kokomi and Furina core, you have a decent amount of flexibility and it can meet a lot of different elemental checks, while having Kokomi as an extremely comfortable driver dealing a good amount of damage. The only problem is that for Kokomi to reach her damage heights, she usually needs Furina, and with Escoffia's release soon who's looking to take Furina teams to new heights, she benefits Hydra and Cryo characters that put out much more damage than Kokomi, like next place on the list and second place. So because Kokomi doesn't utilize her best teammates as well as other characters on this list, I think it's hard to put her any higher than this. For Kokomi's vertical investment, and that's all that needed to be said, so let's carry on. Now, I know what you guys are going to say, but yes, I will be putting Ayato above Kokomi with an asterisk so big that it gains its own gravitational pull and crushes Ayato. Ayato is only going to be a better unit than Kokomi to pull for your account if and only if you get Escoffier, otherwise he's kinda just a potential main character who's very flexible, but his teams don't perform all that well. Ayato Freeze is by far going to be his most standout team, and the reason I want to highlight this especially over Kokomi is due to the fact that Ayato has very good AoE from both his burst and normal attack hits. One of the limiting factors about double Hydra teams, especially without grouping, is the fact that most of the characters using them are very single target oriented, but thankfully that isn't the case for Ayato. Not only that, but Ayato is able to do close to as much damage as mono Hydra Kokomi teams if you're doing the 2 skill per rotation long Ayato rotations, while having significantly better AoE, so I don't see how it's not just a superior team, and a composition where I think Ayato provides a lot of value, so massive W for Ayato mains. But if you aren't getting Escoffier, Ayato is kind of meh. His triple Hydra teams without Escoffier are fine, and you can use him with Nilou as a Hydra applicator, but Ayato's main problem is that he needs to use 2 elemental skills of rotation, otherwise his damage is quite poor, and his energy needs to shoot up a ton. However, there isn't a lot of characters that are able to support 2 separate damage windows like this, while also providing other things a team would need like healing, leaving him to feel very awkward in a lot of teams, which is usually why you pair him with Furina, as she helps with ER needs while being able to support 2 skill windows with how long her uptime is. I don't know, Ayato just isn't that great outside of Furina teams. In terms of vertical investment, please do not pull for Ayato's early constellations. They are extremely mid and his C1 is very conditional. Haran is a very good generalist sword and is a bigger damage increase on Ayato than going to his C2 if you're upgrading from a 4-star sword. And in general, it's just a good weapon. Medium crit rate, 12% elemental damage bonus, and a 40% normal attack bonus, making it the second best weapon for a character like Chlorine, even over a geo buffed Uraku. However, if you aren't an Ayato main, I wouldn't really choose this sword just because Mistsplitter and Uraku tend to be better weapons, as Haran wants a character to do a lot of normal attacks for its value, which Uraku and Mistsplitter are less reliant on. Speaking of Uraku, let's now discuss Chiori, and Geo characters in general are so hard to talk about. I'm putting Chiori this high mostly due to her flexibility more so than her strength. She has 3 main archetypes I'd consider using, being the Zhongli shielded core, which is extremely comfortable, while getting her 2 dolls enabling Chiori to do stronger off-field damage. And then you have the wheelchair core with Sholonen, which to be honest, I'd only really pull Chiori for this team if you plan on getting her C1, which gives her 2 dolls unconditionally. Otherwise, unless you're using a HP scaler like Nuvolette or Muolani, I would rather just use Zhongli, as the damage gap isn't that big on top of now getting a shield. You can also use Kachina Chiori to enable 2 dolls on the scroll set, while getting constant crystallized shields to help your carry tank attacks. And with these 3 team cores, you can slot them with any carry plus a support and get decent mileage out of her. Chiori is also pretty relevant for other geo carries, like you can still use her with Navia even though it's worse than Sholonen most of the time. And then there's Geo Plunge team she slots nicely into, and she's still very good for Itto. So she has her niches too while still being a good general off-field DPS. Her biggest flaw just ends up being that besides adding damage into your teams, she doesn't really do much to buff your teammates, which can feel quite quite limiting, though even with that you get one of the best shielded cores for comfort in the game, on top of the fact that her double geo teams are able to aid almost any carry and give them a team that's not that much worse than their best, which is why I have her above the other characters here that are mostly just DPS units. In regards to vertical investment, just get Chiori C1. It makes her feel like a more complete character and it's like a 50 to 60% damage increase. It's one of the biggest earliest upgrades you can give to a character and gives her more flexibility. Her weapon Uraku is also great, and if you want a good generalist sword, it's a big upgrade on Chiori, while probably being the most flexible DPS sword in the game currently. Shalonen is an extremely flexible character, and even without activating the passive, you're still getting 88 crit damage, 16% normal attack damage bonus, and the 24% skill damage bonus, making it a top 3 option for all the sword DPS, and more flexible than Mistsplitter because of the characters that benefit less from the high base attack of it. I don't really have a clean segue into the next character, so just pretend I said something smart. Entering the top 3, we have Yae, who has 2 playstyles, both of which I think still perform quite well. You first have her on-field playstyle, which usually tends to only be aggravate stuff, and this team still holds up in both AoE and single target, and it uses less contested characters like Dendro units and Fischl. You can also use Yae on field in Chevru's teams, although I wouldn't really recommend it. If you want to play Yae and Chevru stuff, then you can just shift to using her as an off-field DPS instead, focusing more on her turret's damage. Because of the fact that Yae extends rotations and doesn't snapshot buffs like Fischl tends to be better than her in a lot of cases, though Fischl still does have flaws as an off-field unit to where Yae can be better in certain situations. For teams where you aren't benefiting from Fischl's A4, and or the characters aren't doing normal attacks often, Yae can be better. Like in Mizuki teams, Malvika or Linny Chevru's teams prefer Yae, Spread teams also prefer Yae, so she isn't always just worse than Fischl as an off-field DPS, but I'm not sure I'd recommend picking her up just for this. But again, it's really not that bad. Do keep in mind if you're using her off-field playstyle, you want to just give her golden trope and build close to no ER, and simply just never burst unless you're confident you can take down the wave of enemies with it. The rotation length increase is not worth using Yae's burst for, as well as building ER for it, so unless she's your main DPS, it can be ignored. Overall, Yae is just a solid DPS whether you play her on or off field. For vertical investment, I think Yae C1 kind of sucks. It only restores energy, and in Yae's on-field playstyle she already gets enough to where that can be reasonably covered anyways. And if you're playing her as a skill bot, then getting more energy obviously does nothing. And even if you go to her C2, it's only around a 15% damage increase, though I guess it gives some extra range for extra quality of life. Her weapon is honestly the first thing I'd prioritize, and it's a good generalist catalyst, not really that much better than an R5 Width in a lot of scenarios, so unless you have Yae, it's not worth it. Let's finally talk about Ayaka. Yes, Ayaka Escoffier is very good on paper in single target, rivaling other Natlan meta DPS. In regards to whether or not she actually feels that strong in practice, we are yet to see. Ayaka should only be considered if you're getting Escoffier, otherwise she's not worth the pull. Skirk is coming out in the next patch, but we don't know how strong she is, and I'm not going to be evaluating based off of nothing, so until further notice, yes, Ayaka looks to be a very strong and valuable DPS unit, much more than any other DPS on this list, although that could quickly change to where if you want to meta cry DPS and don't particularly like Ayaka, there's not a heavy incentive to pull for her despite how highly I have her ranked here. Let's just hope that didn't piss anyone off, because people get really angry when I talk about Ayaka and Escoffier. For vertical investment, Ayaka C1 doesn't really do anything. You still get the same amount of skill casts per rotation. Her C2 might actually be a lot more valuable now since her best teams don't run groupers, and the mini ice blades can help you still deal damage even if you miss, on top of the fact that it's a really good constellation against big bosses. Honestly though, if you're an Ayaka player, I think you're better off just getting her weapon and or pulling for Furina, Shenhe, or Escoffier constellations. Mistsplitter is also still an amazing sword for anyone who's attack scaling. A lot of characters do have issues upkeeping the 3 stacks of damage, but even with that caveat, for the attack scaling sword DPS, it does usually fall in top 3 for their weapon options, if you care about that. I do still think that if you want to pick up one DPS sword though, your best bet is most likely Uraku with the current roster of characters. Now, to no one's surprise, we have Kazuha at number 1. Even if you want to say he's been power crept by Shalonen, he's still one of the best universal buffers in the game, and even though it can't be reflected that well in cheats, there are still some scenarios where you can have an advantage. He's great for shield breaking, and whenever grouping matters, he'll most likely be a more favored choice than other supports. And there are also teams like Electrocharge and Aggravate where his personal damage matters a lot more, and gives teams constant AoE damage. Kazuha overall is still a good character, you can't really go wrong with pulling him. Do keep in mind though that even with his upsides, as we get more niche supports that just outclass the others in their archetypes, there's become less of a need to have Kazuha, on top of the problems with his buff uptime, but still, you can't really go wrong if you decide to pick him up. For vertical investment, Kazuha C1 is nice, it's comfy, and as I've said a lot of times in the past, his C2 isn't that good anymore because of how conditional it is. A lot of Kazuha teams don't even use his burst anymore, as well as the fact that the field only lasts 8 seconds, so you barely get use out of it. And the 200 EM Kazuha gets only allows him to pass on an 8% more damage bonus. So yeah, Freedom Sword is still a pretty good weapon. It's around a 10% DPS increase team-wide if the character benefits from the stats it gives. So it's good if you want to min-max for a decent amount of the sword supports. But with that, I have nothing else to yap about. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment who you're going to be pulling for in 5.6, if at all, as I'd love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you all. The continued support is appreciated. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.